Good morning, everyone. So, as Andrea said, I work at the Belgian Defense Procurement Division, but I'm not representing them in any shape or form today. I'm also a part-time academic at the University of Nottingham, but I'm not representing them in any shape or form either. I only speak in my own name. So, joint procurement and how the defense sector can help or give you lessons learned that you could use in joint procurement in the classical sector. So let's first have a look, yes, at the legal provisions regarding centralized and joint purchasing in the classical sector directive 2014-24. So first, there is a new definition of centralized purchasing activities. The difference with the former directive, the 2004 directive, is that those activities are performed on a permanent basis. That's the definition of centralized purchasing activities. And the definition of central purchasing body has also slightly evolved in the sense that a central purchasing body is a contracting authority providing centralized purchasing activity. So the definition of central purchasing body has been narrowed a little bit in the sense that a central purchasing body is a body that performs centralized purchasing activities on a permanent basis. Now, does that mean that we are not allowed to do occasional joint procurement? No, because there are new provisions that clearly say that contracting authority may decide to award case-by-case contracts jointly. So, practically speaking, even though we have two different provisions and the definition of centralized purchasing body has evolved, practically speaking, we are still allowed to do the same as before. There are new provisions concerning multinational procurement. I think my personal point of view is that there are more clarifications than anything else, because I don't think that under the 2004 directive, people were not allowed, or contracting authorities were not allowed to do joint procurement or collaborative procurement across borders, but at least those new provisions clarify first that they may do that, and try to clarify which law would apply to those activities. Basically, the procurement has to be done in accordance with the national provisions where the central purchasing body is located. When contracting authorities from different member states decide to do joint procurement, they must conclude first an agreement on the responsibilities of those contracting authorities and on the applicable law to the procurement. They may also set up what they call joint entities under national or EU law that would award contracts for the benefit of all those contracting authorities. Interesting point to note is that those joint entities may be set up under either national or EU law, not under private international law. You will see that this differs from what we do in the defense sector. So those are the provisions in the directive dealing with joint procurement, collaboration between contracting authorities in the classical sector. So, defense procurement, and in particular collaborative defense procurement. This is the way it looks like. First, at the top, you have a number of states who decide to buy defense equipment together. And for that, they appoint what I called here a program management entity that will award the contract and manage the program in their name and on behalf. That program management entity is either one of the participating states acting in the name and on behalf of the others, or an international organization that is set up either specifically to manage that program or more generally to manage a number of such programs. First, note, those states are not necessarily all of them EU member states. As you know, NATO plays an important role in European defense, so the United States might be one of those states and might be, and is actually regularly the program management entity for that program. That program management entity awards a prime contract to a prime contractor for the program, which is in turn usually a joint venture of various companies who in turn award subcontracts to a number of companies. So this looks fairly similar to what happens in the public sector. I'm sorry. What are the three specificities that we can identify for collaborative defense procurement? First, it is always a cooperation between states. Why? Because, as Max Weber has said, if you know him, he's deceased now, so probably you don't know him personally, at least unless you're a vampire or something like that. But he developed the political theory that states have the monopoly on legitimate violence. So usually only states legitimately buy weapons and military equipment. So cooperation between states, which means that public international law is involved, by definition. Second specificity is that very often, almost, most of the case, let's say, those programs are actually large collaborative programs for the development and production of weapon systems. So like development and production of a new transport aircraft, development and production of a new battleship for the benefit of 3 or 4 countries. So this differs slightly from what is usually seen as joint procurement in the public sector, where this concerns mostly the procurement of standard items without too many research and development. And the third specificity, I'm losing my microphone here. A third specificity is what we call juste retour. In French, actually even in English we use the French term, and it means fair industrial return. Under that principle, the work share of the program, so the amount of work that is being performed within the industry of a participating state, should match the financial participation of that state to the program. So for instance, if you have 3 countries and one of the 3 countries is buying half of the combat aircraft, for instance, then juste retour imposes on the subcontracting agreements of the prime contractor that half of the work should be performed by the industry of that participating state. So obviously that's impossible to justify without using an exemption from EU law, and actually that relates to the discussion that the former speaker just mentioned on the last case law, Commission versus Austria, because that's something similar, the use of those exclusions. So if you look at it more closely, you see that that structure is actually a matryoshka doll. I forgot to bring my little Russian doll. You know the matryoshka dolls? Usually I bring a little matryoshka doll and I open it and I show you, but I forgot it. So I will do without the matryoshka doll. Just imagine a Russian puppet. The first matryoshka doll is collaborative procurement. But if you shake it a little bit, just imagine click, 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 you see that there's something more inside. And the first one inside is the law applicable to the decision of the participating states to participate in a specific program. And I'm going to go into more details in the next slides. The second one is the law applicable to the relationship between the participating states and the program management entity. The third one are the procurement rules under which the joint management entity, the program management entity, is going to award the contracts. And then the fourth one is the rule applicable to the interpretation and conflict resolution of the contract itself. So if you go into a little bit more details, relationship or Russian puppet number 1, the decision of the participating states to procure jointly. There, usually the EU Defense Directive, which was mentioned by the previous speaker, usually doesn't apply because there are quite a number of exclusions related to that, related to collaboration. But then, obviously, the EU principles applicable to procurement would still apply, unless exclusions such as in-house, TECAL, or we call it the Hamburg exclusions, it's the Commission versus Germany about joint collaboration, also applies. In many cases, those exclusions will also apply unless some of the participating states are non-EU. I won't go into much details there because actually in the public sector, it's easier because clearly when you use a central purchasing body, when you do joint purchasing, the 2014 directive does not apply. So that's fairly clear. Why is this less clear for defense procurement? Because if you have an international organization, for instance, or a lead nation, it's not that clear that that entity would be a central purchasing body. But that's not so much your problem, it's my problem, because I deal with defense, you don't deal with defense, so you are fairly safe with relationship number 1 because of the provisions of the directive. Relationship number 2, the relationship among the participants and with the program management entity, because we're talking about states, this is usually an intergovernmental arrangement or agreement. Very often it's a memorandum of understanding. It defines the relationships of the participating states, their budgetary commitment, what they want to procure, and so on. One of the problems is that very often we work phase by phase. One memorandum of understanding for research and development, and then research and development is completed, and we say, okay, now let's think about what we're going to do for production. And then production starts to be completed, first delivery happens, and then we think, maybe we should think about in-service support. Now, are we going to continue doing that together or not? So that leads to inefficiencies because obviously every time you need to renegotiate a new MOU, you waste lots of time because you need unanimity. In the public sector directive, there are actually 2 times in those provisions that I mentioned before where the directive says that you must agree the rules of the game, let's say, in case of joint procurement and in case you create a joint management entity. But I argue that in every case you need to agree the rules of the game. Sometimes it will be fairly easy because you just join an existing central purchasing body and you just apply the rules of the central purchasing body. But anyway, if you want to buy together, you have to agree on the requirements of everyone before the contract is placed. So even though it's not mentioned that much in the directive, my view is that you need to think about that in every case. And I'll go back to that a little bit later. Rules on contract award. In the defense sector, actually, that one is fairly easy for you. In the defense sector, in principle, it is the rule or the rules that are being applied are the rule of the program management entity, either an international organization or a lead nation. Question being, do international organizations have to comply with the EU procurement directives? Question mark. Not so much of a problem for you. It's an interesting topic. That's why I wrote a PhD and the book about it. But not so important in the public sector. What is more important is that in those procedures, in those type of programs, the participating states want to keep a very tight control on the decisions of the program management entity. Usually, decisions of the program management entity have to be approved by the unanimity of the participating states, and that obviously is a problem. I'll come back to that later. In the public sector, usually the rules of the state where the central purchasing body is located apply. And in case of joint purchasing, you have to specify which rules apply in the agreement. There is one question that is very much discussed in the literature. Let's assume you have a central purchasing body performing purchasing for a number of contracting authorities from different member states. It's clear that the award of if we award a framework agreement, it's clear that the award of the framework agreement is under the law of the central purchasing body or of the state where the central purchasing body is located. What about when the various states participating in the framework agreement place individual contracts under the framework agreement? Under which law is it? The directives are not so clear about that. It could be the law of the central purchasing body, yes, with the problem that then State A would be awarded contract on the basis of the law of State B, or it could be the law of State A, but then it means that that contract is awarded under a different law than under which the framework agreement was awarded. So that's an open question that will probably at some point end up in the Court of Justice, and the Court of Justice will say which one of the options is the right one. Then the rules on interpretation and dispute resolution of the contract. In the defense sector, usually what we do is we select the law of a member state or a participating state. Sometimes we even choose the law of a non-participating state because it's, for instance, English law is very much used, even if the UK is not participating. In the public sector, it would be usually the rule of the state where the central purchasing body is located, or otherwise as agreed among the participants. Again, problem in case of orders passed under a framework agreement. What if State A has to award the contract on the basis of the law of State B because the central purchasing body awarded the contract or the framework agreement on the basis of its domestic law? That's an open point. So, lessons for the public sector from defense procurement. First, one thing that I usually don't see mentioned in the literature, and that is not mentioned in the directive, is what we call, and shouldn't be mentioned in the directive because it's not really a legal issue, it's what we call the preparation phase. Everything that happens before the agreements between the participating state and then obviously the contract awards is done. How to prepare if a number of countries or a number of contracting authorities want to cooperate, how do you prepare for that? You need to have some kind of coordinated procurement planning and especially coordinated budget planning. Very large, an example, a very large defense procurement program, 20 billion euro, was delayed by 1.5 years because one of the participating countries didn't plan their budget in the year 2000, and in 2001. And then all the other countries had to wait up to April 2003, when that country finally had planned its budget for the program. There was no problem in principle, simply they hadn't planned for their X billion contribution to the program in 2002. So we had to wait up to 2003 for the program to be launched. Very important to, long enough in advance, coordinate your procurement planning and your budget planning if you want to cooperate. If you want to start, or if contracting authorities want to start cooperating on a more structural basis, they should start with quick wins. Not start with too complicated programs, because then you will end up with delays, because complicated programs, whether or not they are cooperative or not, are complex, they take time, they take delays, and then people would say, yeah, but that's because we cooperated with those idiots over there. If we would have done it on our own, it would have been much better. So, in the beginning, focus on quick wins. And you remember what I said about juste retour, industrial return. Avoid that as much as possible because it creates only problems. First, it's illegal. You have to justify it on the basis of exclusions of EU law. But even if you can do that, practically speaking, it leads only to problems. Avoid that, but for large projects, it can still be a political issue. I remember a case that was not a cooperation case, but the Belgian police did a competition, bought handgun from an American company, whilst actually one of the best handgun manufacturer in the world is a Belgian company, but okay, they didn't win the competition. And in the evening, we had the parliament representative of this circumscription where that gun manufacturing is near to Liège, standing in front of the company, being filmed by the television and saying it is entirely unacceptable that the Belgian police doesn't buy Belgian guns. And I was thinking, did you vote or not on the Belgian procurement laws that say non-discrimination on the basis of nationality? So in case of large programs, you still will have those kind of issues coming up, politically speaking. But try to avoid them as much as possible. Second important point, agree a clear governance structure in the beginning. You remember this memorandum of understanding among the participating states. Try to agree that from the beginning. As I said, if you're simply joining in a central purchasing body and applying the existing rules of the central purchasing body, that's fairly simple. If you want to do joint procurement, for instance, or if you want to start a cooperation between a number of contracting authorities, whether or not they are inside one country or cross-border, you have to agree those rules up front. It's very important because if you don't do that, you will end up in problems later. Avoid working case by case. Avoid doing one joint procurement here, one joint procurement there, and then another joint procurement here. Because every time you will need to agree rules, different rules, or the same, but you need to agree every time with the other contracting authorities how you will manage or how the program will be managed. So try to aim for a structural solution. If you think that the local authorities of a certain region would like to cooperate on a regular basis, do that, agree a specific agreement that's valid for more than one procurement. And very importantly, streamline the decision making. Once everybody has provided their requirement, let the program management entity, the central purchasing body, for instance, let them manage the contract. Do not try to interfere with their decisions. Otherwise, you will lose lots of time, lots of discussions, and avoid unanimity as much as possible after the program or the procurement has been launched. I know another defense procurement program where unanimity is always the case in every decision, even after contract award. And there's always at least one country that says, well, actually, I have a problem with that. And then what do you do? So avoid unanimity in decisions. Let the central purchasing body, the program management entity, let them do their job. Other lessons. First, clarify which rules apply to the award process. It's usually fairly clear in the directive, but there is still the problem of the award of contracts under a framework agreement concluded in another country. So anticipate what the Court of Justice is going to say. At least put in your agreement something as to which rules apply when State A wants to award a contract under a framework agreement that has been awarded by a contracting authority under the law of State B. Some generic lessons that are not so much legal, but that you should keep in mind. First of all, if a number of contracting authorities, I hear most of you here are working for law firms. If contracting authorities contact you and say, yeah, that thing it's so complicated. Help us, please. Remember something. The benefits, the financial benefits of the cooperation will always be lower than expected. Always. Because there are cooperation builds some inefficiencies in the process. On the other hand, there will still be economies of scale, but the financial gains will be smaller than expected. They will still be there, but they will be smaller than expected. So don't, or try to keep the hopes not too much up. Second thing, if you are working cross-border with contracting authorities from different countries, do not underestimate cultural differences. The legal culture is very different across Europe. If you take the procurement rules, for instance, the Dutch, basically what they do is a cut and paste on the directive with one article of a few lines dealing with procurement that is under the thresholds of the directive, and it says basically, and any procurement under the threshold for European publication must be performed respecting the basic principles of the EU treaties, full stop. In Belgium, you could think that Netherlands and Belgium are best friends and that our legal culture is very similar. No, it's not. Actually, the Belgian legal culture is more akin to the French legal culture. So there are pages and pages of rules in the Belgian legislation related to contract awards under the EU thresholds. What does that mean? It means that people from a Belgian background will want to regulate as much as possible, to have as much details as possible in the agreements on how the rules apply. And the Dutch will say, well, let's do the contracting authority or the central purchasing body do their work. They're good guys, they're professionals. We don't need to meddle. And so don't underestimate that thing. If there are discussions between lawyers or from different legal backgrounds, you will enter this kind of discussion. The issue of language as well. We all know that legal language is not everyday language. You cannot use a word for another word. And sometimes either within the same language, Dutch, for instance, and Flemish are basically the same language, except that the Dutch have a terrible Arabic accent. I can say that because my future wife is Arabic. And you could think, yeah, it's the same. But actually, they don't use they don't use the same words, even in the same language, for the same concept. So don't underestimate the language differences. Another point, especially if you are working in large programs, avoid monopoly creation. Unfortunately, this is what happened in the Belgian defense sector. One of the big arguments is that, yeah, the European defense sector, industrial sector, is fragmented. True. But then that led in some sectors, like aeronautics, for instance, to the creation of one big company, or maybe two. And then obviously that company is in a monopoly situation and can do not whatever they want, but almost. Don't forget that one of the aims of the new directive is also to increase the participation of small and medium enterprises in procurement. So how coherent is that with joint procurement or common procurement or centralized procurement? If you are making bigger contracts, aren't you excluding small and medium enterprises? And if you want to award a large contract and you split it into lots that you award to different companies, then actually aren't you losing the benefits of joint procurement? So there's a dichotomy there in the directive that is a little bit difficult to manage. So keep that in mind as well, in order not to be sued by SMEs in the Court of Justice. If you are managing large programs, Take a true life approach. Do not split your programs into phases. It leads only to problems because then you need to renegotiate everything at the beginning of each phases. Do that in one big agreement. If you want to build a bridge between two countries, for instance, and you collaborate between contracting authorities on both sides, don't collaborate for the building of the bridge, and then we'll see what happens after that. No, from the beginning, include not only the building of the bridge, but also the maintenance of the bridge. Maybe not necessarily in the same contract, but certainly in the same cooperation agreement between the contracting authorities. So, I'm almost finished. This is to say that you cannot use anything I said, basically. I will disclaim any responsibility for that. Those are 3 books in which I have contributed something that can be useful for you. First one is a book on collaborative defense procurement law. It's defense, obviously, but a lot of the things I mentioned today, I mentioned there as well. So if you take the core of what I'm saying there, and maybe not the details, you can apply that as well to the public sector. I wrote something a little bit similar, shorter in this book, and that one is interesting. I wrote also a chapter in that book, Transnational Law of Public Contract, deals with a lot of aspects, it's a book like this, deals with a lot of aspects of transnational law of public contract, certainly interesting reading, and not only the chapter I wrote. So thank you very much for your attention, and I give the word back to Andrea.
Thank you. I'm actually a member of the board of an organization called Transparency International, Sweden.
Yes.
And it has been shown that defense procurement is where there is the most corruption, because there's enormous contracts and very strange middlemen in the Africa somewhere. And is this your opinion?
Yeah, it's in Europe, obviously, much less than in other parts of the world. But you're right. I wouldn't say that it's the area where there is the most corruption, because I think that construction also is a little bit difficult. Yeah. But it's certainly an area where that is the most corruption prone, because as you said, very large contracts, that juste retour principle, lots of things happening below the radar. So yeah, it's a sector that is at high risk indeed.
Do we have any questions? No? You must have been very explicit. Thank you so much.
Thank you.